Carbohydrate improves endurance performance, but not in the way many people think. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the different ways in which carbohydrate can improve performance, how carbohydrate really works in the body when you're exercising, and how you can use this information to improve your own performance. Hello and welcome to the Endurance Science Podcast with me, Matt Carpenter. The aim of this podcast is to cut through the noise and misinformation that social media presents us and discuss what the science really says about endurance performance. And in this episode, we've got a really interesting one inspired by a recent publication that looked at the role of carbohydrates on muscle glycogen. But to set the scene, I want to talk about where carbohydrate is stored in our body and what happens when we consume carbohydrate gels and drinks and things like that. Once we've discussed the background physiology on how carbohydrate works, we can discuss all the different ways carbohydrate may improve performance. And the beauty of the science of carbohydrate ingestion is that there's not one way carbohydrate improves performance. This isn't like a beetroot juice or like a sodium bicarbonate where you have one specific pathway. There are numerous avenues by which carbohydrate can improve performance. And based on the type of exercise you do, impacts the specific mechanism by which carbohydrate might be working. So we've got a number of different mechanisms to go through. But the one most common reason people think carbohydrate improves performance isn't as clear-cut as we once thought. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So let's get started with carbohydrate in our body. Where is it? How do we store it? And how can we use the carbohydrate that we have? So we have around 2,000 calories of carbohydrate on us at any given point. Now, there's a lot of variability in this number. It depends on your training status. So better trained athletes tend to have higher capacity to store carbohydrate. Depends on your diet, whether it's high carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, etc., and on a number of other factors. But we can say as an average, we've got about 2,000 calories worth. And where is this stored? Well, about 3/4 tends to live in our muscles. So we've got around 1,500 to 2,000 sometimes calories of carbohydrate within the muscle. This is called muscle glycogen. And then we have around 400 to 500 calories, again as an average, of carbohydrate stored in our liver. And that's called our liver glycogen. Glycogen is simply the storage form of carbohydrate. And so to think about how we break down carbohydrate, once we've got our carbohydrate down to its simplest form, which is a glucose molecule, our body can convert glucose into glycogen for storage and do the exact opposite reaction and convert that glycogen back into glucose to be used by our muscles. So we have this beautiful reversible reaction that allows us to either store glucose if we need to, or use our stored glucose, which is our glycogen. And these two pools of glucose that we have, our liver and our muscle glycogen, have different roles within the body. And these are now being referred to as our small glucose pool versus our large glucose pool. And the concept is that they kind of work slightly independently of each other. Our liver glycogen is constantly working, and its role is to maintain our blood glucose levels. So we have glucose continuously circulating in our blood, not very much, say 4 to 6 millimoles of glucose in our blood at all times. This glucose is traveling around the body, being used by our muscles, our organs, such as the brain, and our digestive system. And so our glucose is constantly circulating around and being extracted by what needs it. The liver is constantly topping up that blood glucose. And so when we see someone with stable blood glucose, that doesn't mean the same glucose is continuously circulating in the blood. We're always using glucose to some extent. So what's happening is that the rate of glucose utilization by the body is being matched by our liver's ability to break down its glycogen and feed that glucose nicely back into the bloodstream. And so what we see is stable blood glucose. But glucose is always being used to some extent. A great example of that is when we sleep. When we sleep, our metabolic rate is very low, and so we're not burning or expending many calories. However, when you wake up after sleeping through the night, your liver glycogen is fairly low. And that's because even though you've not been using much energy, it's still a long time period. And so you've used a fair amount of your liver glycogen just topping up blood glucose overnight because that glucose is being used around the body. And so that's one of the reasons that carbohydrate can improve performance, because it can top up your liver glycogen that is depleted after an overnight fast. Anyway, I don't want to run before we can walk, so let's go to muscle glycogen and talk about the role of muscle glycogen. The beauty of muscle glycogen is that we're much better at holding on to it, and so because we can use our liver glycogen at the drop of a hat very quickly, get it into the blood and utilized, we're much more careful with our muscle glycogen. And so once you've done your carbohydrate load over the days before exercise, your muscle glycogen will be nice and topped up, and it's not going to be meaningfully affected by going to sleep overnight because in resting conditions and at low intensities, we don't use much muscle glycogen. We're able to use our liver glycogen and predominantly our fat stores to help spare muscle glycogen. When we start to exercise, that's when we really start to use muscle glycogen as an energy source. And the beauty of it is that we've got much more glycogen stored in our muscles than we do in our liver. So we've got much more to use for our exercise bouts. And now that's how we store carbohydrates. We've got that carbohydrate in our body at any point to use when we want to. But what about when we're taking a gel or a carbohydrate drink just before exercise or during our exercise? What is happening to that gel to get it into our muscles or into our bloodstream to go into our muscles, for example? So when we're consuming, say, a gel or a carbohydrate drink, that tends to be either glucose or a fructose glucose combination. The reason that these carbohydrate sources are used are because they are easy to break down, and we'll talk about the difference in the digestion of glucose and fructose later on. But if we focus on glucose, glucose is the simplest form of carbohydrate we have, which is why it's the same as the glucose circulating in our blood. And so it requires much less digestion. So when we consume our gel or our carbohydrate drink, ingestion or digestion, I should say, starts straight away in the mouth with our salivary amylase, which is an enzyme we have in our mouth. And that begins the process of breaking down the carbohydrate. So we get an element of digestion here, although it's not very large. The majority happens further down. And so we consume our carbohydrate drink, our carbohydrate gel, goes down our esophagus and makes its way into our stomach. And now no digestion occurs in the stomach, but what we do get is the gel becoming part of the chyme and being released into the duodenum. And this happens to get it into the small intestine. And the small intestine is a really important part of carbohydrate breakdown, particularly telling us why we've got glucose-fructose combinations. The small intestine is where this glucose and fructose gets transported over to the bloodstream. And now we have maximal capacities for glucose and fructose, and that maximal capacity is found in the small intestine. So when we go above our maximal absorption rate of carbohydrates, so that's above 60 grams an hour for glucose and above 30 grams an hour for fructose, it's the small intestine where this is getting held up. Okay, so this is stopping the process. Our glucose gets transported from the small intestine into the bloodstream through our SGLT1 transporters, our sodium glucose transporters. On the other hand, our fructose gets transported by GLUT5 transporters. And these different transporters are why adding fructose allows you to consume more carbohydrate, because they use a different transporter. And here they exit and go through hepatic processing, so they go through the liver. And it's the liver that gets to decide what we want to do with this glucose or with this fructose. Do we need it right now for energy, or can we store it for a later date? So if you're consuming carbohydrate, say you're just eating a standard meal, you're sitting down, you're not doing much, when that carbohydrate is broken down and it gets to the liver may well say, let's turn this into glycogen. And if it does that, it means you can store it for a later date. However, when we're exercising, which tends to be when we're taking gels and drinks, you're not going to be storing or holding on to that carbohydrate because you need it right now. And so rather than converting it into glycogen, what we're going to do instead is get that into the blood as soon as we can to be transported to the muscles. And so then you have glucose leaving the liver to go more or less straight into the bloodstream, and fructose itself is largely metabolized within the liver, can be converted into glucose and then go and support that role of energy production, just like glucose. And so once glucose is in your bloodstream, well, then it's going to go to the working muscles, most often your legs if you're a runner or a cyclist, and go and help generate energy that way. And so that's what carbohydrate is doing when you're consuming a gel or consuming a carbohydrate drink. It's being rapidly metabolized and then going to your working muscles as glucose to support aerobic energy production. So what are the different ways carbohydrate ingestion can improve performance? I want to start this with a bit of a history lesson, but trust me, it's interesting. The predominant theory for many years, and there are a number of different mechanisms, but the theory that I think has infiltrated the running and cycling community more than any is that carbohydrate spares muscle glycogen. So I discussed that we've got around 1,500 calories of muscle glycogen. And so the issue when you go above, say, 2 hours of exercise is that you're at risk of running out of carbohydrate. And so it stands to reason that consuming carbohydrate during exercise allows you to use less of the carbohydrate that you store, use more of the carbohydrate you're consuming, and therefore you can go for longer with muscle glycogen ready when you need it. And the origins of this stem back to the 1960s with some unbelievably good research done by Jonas Bergström et al. And they did a number of studies that were correlating the role of muscle glycogen and exercise performance. But to do that wasn't as easy as it is now because they had to essentially create a whole technique to do this. And it's a technique that's still used to this day. So they invented the muscle biopsy technique, and that involved pulling essentially part of the muscle out, and that was the vastus lateralis. Part of the quadricep muscle was pulled out before exercise, and part was pulled out after exercise. They did well to get participants for this. So you would go into the lab, you would have your leg anesthetized, you would then have a sample of muscle taken out, then you would do exhaustive exercise, and then what do you want to do when you finished exercise? Have some of your muscle taken out. They're going to take out more at the end. And with that tiny sample of muscle, they could look at a number of things, one of which was how much glycogen do you have in the muscle itself? And they found that exercise was terminated when muscle glycogen was low. Now, the conclusion they made from this is that muscle glycogen is a key determinant of exercise. And it made complete sense with what they were seeing, that muscle glycogen was running out and then exercise was terminating. Now, you can never really get to zero muscle glycogen, and there's clearly some kind of feedback loop going on with the brain to stop you ever getting to no muscle glycogen left at all. It would obviously have negative consequences, but it would get low enough that exercise would terminate. And so this has been the predominating theory since those seminal papers in the 1960s. But it's not the only theory because, as I mentioned, we have that second pool of carbohydrate, our liver glycogen. And the liver glycogen is important for a number of reasons. Number one, it's usable carbohydrate. But number two, it's helping us keep our blood glucose stable. And a second key theory around the importance of carbohydrate is helping us maintain stable blood glucose, or at least preventing us going into hypoglycemia, so low blood glucose. When blood glucose drops during exercise, it gets detected by your brain and you get a cascade of counter-regulatory hormones that start increasing in circulation. Glucagon, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, growth hormone, all increase to try and help get blood glucose back up to normal levels. You'll also get glycogenolysis in the liver, so the liver breaking down glucose to try and get blood glucose back to normal. The problem there is, if you've already depleted your liver glycogen, well, then it's not going to be very efficient at helping get your blood glucose back up. And that's what can happen during exercise. Many people will have experienced underfueling during exercise and just feeling completely empty, completely broken. I mentioned last week, this is really common at mile 20 of a marathon. Go stand there and see it for yourself. And that is that cascade of hormones trying to help you out, but often in insufficient fueling situations, it's not able to do that effectively. So what happens? During continuous exercise, our body has a way of helping us try and spare that carbohydrate and reduce our chance of hypoglycemia. And that is increasing fat oxidation. And so during continuous exercise, as we go along, carbohydrate oxidation, or our burning of carbohydrate, goes down and fat oxidation goes up. But we're still using carbohydrate. And so if we're not fueling sufficiently, we're eventually going to go hypoglycemic. And that will eventually result in exercise termination. And so you there have two key mechanisms by which we believe carbohydrate improves performance: sparing muscle glycogen and also sparing liver glycogen, which allows us to maintain blood glucose levels and prevent hypoglycemia. And before I discuss the merits of each of these, there's a third mechanism, and that is called the cephalic response to carbohydrate. And there's some really cool research on this. I promise it's more interesting than it sounds. The cephalic response is a central nervous system response, effectively your brain responding to carbohydrate in your mouth. It's mediated through the vagus nerve, and a number of changes occur just from the sensing of carbohydrates in your mouth. You get a level of insulin secretion, you get improved gastric mobility, increased splanchnic blood flow adjustments, and some shifts that prepare the body for handling those carbohydrates. And the reason that we know this can impact performance independently of the impact that carbohydrate has on our muscle and liver glycogen is that these effects all occur even if you don't swallow the carbohydrate. Some of you may have come across research on carbohydrate mouth rinse before. This is where this all stems. You can rinse your mouth with carbohydrate and get these effects and isolate them away from the impact of carbohydrate on muscle and liver glycogen. And in some situations, this itself can improve performance. And it seems to be through the central nervous system. So the carbohydrate that we ingest is essentially impacting your brain, impacting your reward and motivation, impacting your perceived effort, so exercise feels slightly easier, and changing your motor output. And so this is where carbohydrate mouth rinsing can improve performance, but part of it is in the brain itself, not even related to liver or muscle glycogen. And some really interesting recent research, this is 2026 research, has just been published looking at comparing carbohydrate mouth rinse with a mouth strip that contains carbohydrate. And the carbohydrate mouth strip seemed to outperform the use of carbohydrate mouth rinse. And so you may see in the coming months more research and potentially products coming out that are carbohydrate mouth strips aiming to get the benefits of this sensing acting on the brain. And so that's really important, that last mechanism there, because it gives rationale to the use of carbohydrate in different types of exercise that wouldn't normally be improved from consuming carbohydrate. And I'm going to get to that in a second. So now I've outlined the 3 key mechanisms by which carbohydrate can improve performance. What I'm going to talk about now is what the current state of research is on each of these 3 mechanisms. Which one is the most important? Which one might not be important as we once thought, and which one is maybe the least important? And then what I'm going to do is contextualize that within different types of exercise. So what does this mean for running a 5K? What does this mean for running a half marathon? What does this mean for running a marathon and beyond? And the same applies to cycling, of course, if you just adjust the timeframes it's taking for these types of exercise. So let's start with muscle glycogen, because this is really the inspiration of this topic. A recent meta-analysis that looked at carbohydrate ingestion during prolonged exercise and its role on net skeletal muscle glycogen utilization. Put simply, what effect does consuming carbohydrate during exercise really have on our ability to spare muscle glycogen, that key mechanism that came from the original Bergstrom et al. Studies. And this meta-analysis is the first to look in detail at what does the bulk of the literature suggest. And I was really pleased this came out, because this was published just after I'd finished writing a large section of my PhD. And in that section, I was looking at where do the benefits of carbohydrate really come from? And I came to a similar conclusion to this meta-analysis, looking through the studies on muscle glycogen breakdown, that actually the data is not as clear as many people would believe on the role of carbohydrate on muscle glycogen. But on the contrary, it's very, very clear when it comes to liver glycogen. So there was a paper in 2015 by Javier Gonzalez, who's an academic at the University of Bath, and they looked at whether muscle glycogen or liver glycogen is spared by carbohydrate ingestion. And they found that carbohydrate was very effective at sparing liver glycogen, but didn't spare muscle glycogen at all. And that's the one that really got me thinking originally on these lines. Now, what this meta-analysis has done has looked at not just that study, but all the relevant papers on it. And they found that there was a glycogen sparing effect of carbohydrate, but that it isn't very big. Okay, so carbohydrate does spare muscle glycogen, but it doesn't do it very well. Okay, so the effect is fairly small. Just because an effect is small, it doesn't mean it's irrelevant. Okay, so this is still an important consideration. It's just not possibly as important as we once thought. What was also really interesting is that the authors noted no dose-response relationship. And what that means is that more carbohydrate was not necessarily better for sparing muscle glycogen. Talking to the authors, they suggested that 45 grams an hour seemed to be sufficient to spare muscle glycogen, and there was no evidence within their meta-analyses that anything beyond 45 grams an hour was better at sparing muscle glycogen. Now, this doesn't mean that you should never consume more than 45 grams an hour, okay? There's certainly a debate about the quantity of carbohydrates required, but just focusing on that role of muscle glycogen sparing, they couldn't find any evidence that above 45 grams an hour was better. And so their conclusion was that carbohydrate ingestion during exercise leads to a small but statistically significant reduction in skeletal muscle glycogen utilization, and no consistent moderating variables were identified. So you've got some really interesting findings here, because any exercise that goes above 2 hours has the risk of being glycogen limiting. So muscle glycogen can be a limiting factor. And this evidence suggests that consuming carbohydrate will spare muscle glycogen, but it's not overly effective. Now, saying that, when you get to half an hour before your exercise, there's no better way of sparing muscle glycogen than consuming carbohydrate. The only other way is to run slower, cycle slower, which you probably don't want to do. So it's still a very important tool, but it's not the magic we expected. Now, on the contrary, the findings when it comes to liver glycogen are stark. Okay, so we know that carbohydrate ingestion during exercise does a fantastic job of sparing liver glycogen. This is consistent across research. And therefore, it's very effective at preventing hypoglycemia as well. And so we know carbohydrate improves performance. We also know it's a lot better at helping us spare liver glycogen than it is sparing muscle glycogen. So it may be that whilst muscle glycogen sparing is an important aspect of carbohydrate ingestion and the benefits behind it, that liver glycogen sparing may be slightly more important, or at least more important than we once thought. And now we have the final mechanism, the impact of carbohydrate on the brain. And now there's some evidence that carbohydrate mouth rinse, for example, or using carbohydrate mouth strips can improve performance. And so there seems to be an effect there. But the findings are not as stark as they are when you're consuming carbohydrate itself. And so I would consider this a nice cherry on top when it comes to the benefits of carbohydrate, but not as marked as the impact on muscle and liver glycogen. So the way I would see these three mechanisms is that carbohydrate is brilliant at sparing liver glycogen and therefore helping you maintain blood glucose. And this is probably the main factor in the benefit of carbohydrate in most cases. It also has an important role, though not very big, on muscle glycogen sparing. And now, even if it's not sparing muscle glycogen dramatically, that's still important as exercise gets beyond 2 to 3 hours in particular. So your marathon runners, your ultra marathon runners, your people cycling repeatedly, well, carbohydrate is still important to help you spare muscle glycogen. Now, one of the key takeaways I took from this paper that showed that there was a sparing of muscle glycogen, but it wasn't that effective, is that it only increases the need to be good at burning fat. Because in the long term, the best way of sparing muscle glycogen is to be burning more fat and less carbohydrate. One of the adaptations to training is that you burn more fat at higher intensities. And so that's something I'm going to talk a lot more about on this channel, is actually looking at how to become a better fat burner during exercise. And there are ways to test this, things like the Fat Max test, which is something that I'm looking forward to hopefully doing some in our own lab in Northampton very soon. And so that's definitely going to be a topic for future conversations because it's a massively under-discussed area of exercise in my view. But what we have is carbohydrate, fantastic for liver glycogen sparing, okay for muscle glycogen sparing, and then the added benefit, the cherry on top of having an impact on the brain. Now, the interesting thing is that it doesn't take much carbohydrate to spare liver glycogen. So recent work from the likes of Tim Noakes, Philip Prinz, etc., has shown that 10 grams an hour of carbohydrate is enough to prevent hypoglycemia, and you get performance improvements compared to placebo. And this led to their highly controversial and thought-provoking paper that they published recently that suggested that you don't need as much carbohydrate as you thought, and actually 10 grams an hour is a sufficient amount of carbohydrate to spare liver glycogen, maintain blood glucose, and therefore more is not required. Now, I found their paper really interesting. I enjoyed reading it. I don't think that those are the conclusions I would take from my reading of the literature. So I don't recommend 10 grams an hour of carbohydrate to many, if any, individuals engaging in endurance exercise. And the reason is that, number one, like I mentioned, just because carbohydrate isn't great at sparing muscle glycogen, it doesn't mean that that effect isn't important. A small effect can still be important in some circumstances. And so that sparing of muscle glycogen is still important, even if it's not as great as we once thought. And secondly, one of the key arguments from that paper is that there's no dose response effect of carbohydrate on performance. And now, I would contend that there's a number of papers that demonstrate increasing carbohydrate ingestion during exercise in prolonged exercise, we're talking 2 hours plus, improves performance, okay? And so you have papers that compare 15, 30, and 60 grams of carbohydrate, and they find more improves performance further. And to me, that demonstrates a level of dose response where, to an extent, more carbohydrate is better. Now, that brings us to, what about the vast quantities of carbohydrate that athletes are consuming now, say 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour in some situations, sometimes even higher? Well, it's safe to say that there's not much research on that, but there's a lot of athletes doing it. And we do have some data. Now, to date, there's no data on direct performance improvements, not that they won't be published at some point. I'm sure there are researchers doing that work. What we do see is potential improvements in exercise economy, which could theoretically lead to performance improvements, and a massive increase in gastrointestinal distress, GI issues. And so right now, I don't think there's enough data to suggest many athletes go above 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate. I think there's an interesting discussion to be had around how much carbohydrate do you need per hour, between 45 to 90, okay? I don't think more is necessarily better for everyone. I think a lot of people find it very hard to stomach 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour. And in the knowledge that above 45 grams, you're not getting much more of a glycogen sparing effect, I think that a lot of athletes will be fine consuming 45 grams an hour for prolonged exercise events. However, it's true that there are some studies showing 90 grams an hour is a more effective dose if you can tolerate it. So there seems to be rationale that 90 grams an hour is effective. And here we're talking 2 hour plus events, so events that could be glycogen sparing. I will get on to the benefits of carbohydrate in, say, your half marathons and below, your 5Ks, after this, because it's a bit different because it's not glycogen sparing. But when we talk about glycogen sparing events, there's a lot of debate about the amount of carbohydrate required. Number one thing I would do as an athlete right now is experiment. Try increasing your carbohydrate during exercise, see if you can tolerate higher loads of carbohydrate, and see how you feel. There's theory behind the 120 grams an hour improving efficiency that may improve performance. And now there's an issue when you go above 90 grams an hour, and that's that it actually accelerates the amount of glycogen you're losing from your muscle. So what seems to happen is that when you're getting carbohydrate essentially build up in your small intestine, that might send a signal to increase muscle glycogen breakdown. And so you might risk actually running out of muscle glycogen sooner if you consume above 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate. And so I'm not in a position to recommend anything more than 90 grams an hour at the moment. I don't think the data's there for us, particularly in sub-elite athletes, okay? As always, it's very difficult comparing elite athletes to sub-elite. It's comparing apples to oranges to an extent. Elite athletes, by definition, are freaks. And I mean that in the most complimentary way possible. Genetically, physiologically, freaks. Okay, and so what applies to an elite athlete doesn't often apply to a non-elite athlete. So when it comes to carbohydrate recommendations for long periods of exercise, I would recommend 45 grams plus. And I think many people will be just fine on 45 grams an hour based on the theories I presented so far in this podcast. That's not to say some people might benefit from going beyond that. I would suggest experimenting, looking at how much you can tolerate. If we think about exercise modalities, this is where there's a big difference between, say, a marathon and a long duration ultramarathon, because firstly, to consume 90 grams an hour for an ultramarathon, you might be consuming, say, 900 grams of carbohydrate. It's a huge amount to tolerate. It's not too difficult if you're running for, say, 3 hours to load up on carbohydrate to get you 90 grams an hour in, because you've only got to deal with 3 hours worth of exercise. That's only 270 grams of carbohydrate in total. Hard enough for some, but comparing that to someone who's doing 10 hours worth of exercise, it can be a lot more difficult to stomach the carbohydrate. The data on gastrointestinal issues in ultramarathon runners is remarkable. So part of the game of ultramarathon running or ultra endurance exercise, because cycling this applies to as well, is avoiding gastrointestinal distress. And that might mean dropping carbohydrate ingestion. And again, that might also mean training yourself to become better at burning fat. So that would be my recommendation for carbohydrates for long duration exercises. And there's an important note here that it's easier to ingest higher volumes of carbohydrate when you're cycling. The reason for this is that the stomach is basically moving less. There's less pressure on the stomach. And so GI risks are lower as a cyclist. And so that means that cyclists are more likely to be able to consume higher volumes of carbohydrate. And you see this when we see athletes that are consuming large quantities of carbohydrate tend to be cyclists. Okay. So as a runner, I think for most people, 45 to 60 grams an hour is perfectly sufficient. As a cyclist, you may be able to consume more, and therefore it's worth experimenting with. But my view is that most people don't need to go beyond this. Now, as always, I have nothing to sell. I am not wedded to this hypothesis. In fact, it's something I really want to study, and I'm trying to create a study that can look at something along these lines. I'm always ready to change my mind. And if I see evidence that suggests that 120 grams an hour is the optimal carbohydrate dose for sub-elite athletes, I will happily come on this podcast and say I was wrong. Been wrong about many, many things before. I'll probably do a podcast on it. I'm not wedded to any of my hypotheses, and I'm always very, very open to change my mind. So that's my view based on the literature now. As always, of course, that is subject to change. So now we've finished going through the ultra endurance, say marathon plus space, I want to talk about the impact or the role of carbohydrate on shorter duration activities. So that gives us, say, our non-glycogen depleting activity from half marathons down to 10Ks, down to 5Ks, things like that. Now, here things start to get interesting. You could say on one hand, if muscle glycogen won't be getting depleted, we don't need to worry about consuming even 45 grams an hour. We might be able to get away with less. And to some extent, that might be true. It's safe to say there's still a role of carbohydrate, but it's quite nuanced. And this was really brought to light by a recent paper, 2025, Shirebauer et al. And they looked at exercise that was lasting around 35 minutes. It was done in the morning, and they made sure all their participants had consumed at least 5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate per day for the 2 days leading up to exercise. Now, they came in and were given either carbohydrate or a placebo with no carbohydrate in at all. And you would expect the carbohydrate to improve performance compared to being fasted. What they actually found was no impact of carbohydrate over the 37-minute exercise bout. The likely reason is that because they consumed sufficient carbohydrate quantities, that there was no risk of muscle glycogen depletion because the exercise wasn't long enough, and because they had adequately carbohydrate fueled in the days before exercise, they didn't become hypoglycemic during exercise. And as a result, what we could say is that when you're doing short duration exercise where you're not at risk of being hypoglycemic, there's no need for carbohydrate. But that's not the conclusion I would make, because just because it's not improving performance in that one study, we also got to note it's not making performance worse. And even though we might not be getting clear benefits in the data, based on the theory, particularly looking at the role of the central nervous system and that impact on the brain that I mentioned you can get from carbohydrate mouth rinse, I would still suggest some carbohydrate, even for non-glycogen limiting exercise. And so when you've got your 5Ks, your 10Ks that you could theoretically do here, and there might be minimal difference to carbohydrate, those small differences are still worth something. And so when you're doing exercise for less than an hour, I would absolutely not recommend anything during exercise. You don't need a gel, you don't need a drink, but I would make sure you're consuming carbohydrates in your breakfast in the hours before exercise. This will help increase your liver glycogen relative to what it would have been if you hadn't consumed anything. We used to say that breakfast will help you increase liver glycogen. It turns out that consuming breakfast before exercise doesn't actually increase liver glycogen. What it does is that it prevents a continued decrease in liver glycogen. So our liver is quite big in the morning and it goes through its own circadian rhythm where it changes in size. The liver's amazing. And so the liver gets smaller as we're awake. Consuming carbohydrate increases the amount of carbohydrate in our liver to an extent, but the liver's getting smaller. So what actually happens, and some recent data, 2025, showed this. It demonstrated that what happens when you consume carbohydrate in the morning is that it helps maintain carbohydrate despite the liver getting smaller. So it's not quite right to say that liver glycogen is increased from your breakfast, it's maintained. But in any case, it's stopping it declining. Now, what this is going to do, it's going to reduce the chance of hypoglycemia. And not all of us have the chance to measure glucose whilst we're running, and we don't want to risk it. And so I would suggest that breakfast in the morning is still an important way to reduce your risk of hypoglycemia during exercise. Remember that we don't have that much liver glycogen on us, particularly after we've woken up after an overnight fast. And so, although the impact of carbohydrates in the morning on performance for short durations isn't as clear cut as we once thought, there's still a role for it, in my view. Now, that role becomes more important as duration goes up. So I've gone through the long stuff, your marathons and above. I've gone through the short stuff, your 5Ks and your 10Ks. So what about that middle ground, your half marathons? Well, here your focus shouldn't be on maintaining or sparing muscle glycogen, because you shouldn't be running out of muscle glycogen during a half marathon if you fuel correctly in the days before. But you now severely run the risk of hypoglycemia. So it's all about sparing liver glycogen. And so, do you need a lot of carbohydrate? No. But should you take some? Absolutely, I would. A really good example of this is the guy that won the Hackney Half last year. It's a guy called Hugo, got a good YouTube account, Hugo Fry. He mentioned to me that he consumed 1 gel during the Hackney Half. I think this is a really good way to do it. He ran it in 66 minutes. Most of us will be running it in longer than that. But there's no need to try and aim for a certain number of grams per hour of carbohydrate during a half marathon, even if you're running for, say, 2 hours and beyond. Because the longer you're running for, the lower the intensity you're running for, therefore the less carbohydrate you're using. So there's not need to load up on loads of carbohydrate. You don't need to get to the line with 4, 5, 6 gels. I would suggest that for most, 1 gel sufficient. That's, say, 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrate. That'll be enough to make sure you maintain blood glucose throughout the race. To be safe, if you're going for longer durations and you want blood glucose to stay stable, you might take 2 gels, for example, in a 2-hour half marathon. You might take one at 45 minutes and one at an hour and a half. That'll just make sure your liver glycogen's nice and stable during your exercise bout. But there's no need to pound carbohydrates for something like a half marathon and below. because you simply don't need to. The last thing to mention here, I guess, is the cephalic phase response. So often I'll see people consuming carbohydrate gels, say right before a park run, your 5Ks, your 10Ks. Now, you might think, what's the point of that? But actually, that's a nice way of getting that cephalic phase response to exercise. And so I would suggest short duration, you can get your carbohydrates in at breakfast and then utilize that cephalic phase response by either carbohydrate mouth rinsing or easiest way for most, if you don't want to look strange drinking carbohydrate and spitting it back out, is just swallowing it or using a carbohydrate gel, having a gel right before you race, as long as you can stomach it okay. And that's going to give you the best of the cephalic phase response, which is not great. It's not huge, but it's something. You want to get all those performance benefits you can and making sure you get your breakfast in. That's the same for a half marathon. If you wanted to use cephalic phase response, you're getting that from your gels on the course. You don't necessarily need one right at the start. So you're getting your liver glycogen maintenance, prevention of hypoglycemia, and that cephalic phase response from the carbohydrates you're consuming during your race. And so what we have there in less than an hour, magically, is a deep dive into the physiology of carbohydrate metabolism during exercise. How do we store carbohydrate? How do we use the carbohydrate we consume? How does this relate to exercise all the way from 5Ks up to ultra marathons? And therefore, how much carbohydrate should you consume for those different races? Now, I want to make sure that the takeaways from this episode are clear and unambiguous in that there's no one way to do this. There's not a best way that everyone should do. There's a huge individual response to things like this. And that's why I was very clear to caveat in terms of your ultra marathons and your marathons. The amount of carbohydrate might be different for you to someone else, to someone else, to someone else. The important thing for me is to note that what is carbohydrate doing? And that physiology helps guide us in terms of how much carbohydrate is best for someone. And that's particularly evident in things like half marathons and below, where they're not muscle glycogen limiting, and therefore the need for carbohydrate is reduced. There we have a full podcast on carbohydrate. That is a beautiful deep dive, if I may say so myself. You guys getting ahead of me now. But based on some really recent data that I found super interesting. So I hope this is helpful. I'm going to put all the papers I've mentioned in the show notes so you can look at them at your leisure. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm really enjoying doing these podcasts and I really appreciate the feedback I've had on them so far. They've been really positive. Those of you that are watching this, you'll even note that I've bought myself a webcam now, so I don't look like I've been filmed on a potato, which is revolutionary. So one benefit of this is that I may actually learn how to use technology. If you've got any topic suggestions, then I'm always open to them. To give you a bit of an update on my plan for this podcast moving forward, these weekly episodes will come out every Tuesday, and over time, particularly once I've been able to build it a little bit, what I want to be able to do is highlight the work of both academics and people working in the field within sports science and exercise physiology. It's one thing hearing from me every week, and I'll continue to do these episodes. They seem to be going down well, and I hope this is interesting. But what I want to be able to do is bring on experts on different topics within academia. There's loads of really interesting work going on, and much of it doesn't get the attention it deserves. And so what I want to do more and more, particularly on topics that I don't have a great understanding of, I'm not going to blag topics I don't understand for you because that's not what this channel is about. I want to bring on people that know their stuff. And so people that are doing their PhDs on certain topics, people that are published in certain areas, and bring them on to talk about their research and deep dive that way, because I think that's a really great way of showcasing science and also helping listeners improve their own performance and understand where science is going. It's also a great way to get past the marketing that happens, to learn about people in the field of academia giving you the lowdown of what does the science really say. So I really want to use this platform to platform academics and platform people working in the real world, showing how do they translate science into practice. I think that'd be a really interesting one. So I'm also planning on starting some question and answer sessions. So we'll start to ask your questions over on Instagram. And yeah, I'm really excited to continue this podcast. I've really enjoyed doing it over the last few weeks. If you do like it, then please do drop me a rating, trying to get this podcast out to the masses. So if we can bring science to the world of endurance. Any feedback is always welcome, so please do let me know. I'm trying to make this as good as possible. Other than that, I'll see you next week, and thank you very much for listening.